The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape as Thomas Mitchell rode his horse along the dusty trail. He was a cattle rancher in his early 30s with weathered hands and a face marked by years under the harsh Arizona sun. His small ranch sat on the edge of Apache territory, a fact that kept most settlers away but never bothered Thomas much. He had always believed in keeping to himself and respecting the land that belonged to others. On this particular morning, Thomas was checking his fence lines when he heard gunshots echoing from the nearby canyon. The sound made his horse nervous, and Thomas felt his own heart rate increase. Gunfire in these parts usually meant trouble, and trouble often involved conflicts between settlers and the Apache tribes who had lived on this land for generations. As he rode closer to investigate, Thomas saw smoke rising from behind a cluster of red rocks. His better judgment told him to turn back, but something deeper urged him forward. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was the same instinct that had led him to choose this remote piece of land in the first place. When Thomas reached the source of the commotion, he found the aftermath of what appeared to be a skirmish. Several horses lay dead, and the ground was scattered with broken arrows and empty bullet casings. The scene told a story of violence that made Thomas's stomach turn. He had seen conflicts before, but the waste of life never became easier to witness. As he prepared to leave this place of tragedy, a soft moan caught his attention. Thomas dismounted and carefully searched among the rocks until he found a young Apache woman, barely conscious and bleeding from a wound on her shoulder. She appeared to be around 20 years old, with long black hair braided with small beads and traditional clothing that marked her as someone of importance within her tribe. The woman's eyes fluttered open as Thomas approached, and instead of fear, he saw a fierce determination that surprised him. She tried to sit up but winced in pain from her injury. Thomas knew he faced a difficult decision. Taking her with him could be seen as kidnapping by her people, but leaving her here wounded would likely mean her death. Without thinking too much about the consequences, Thomas gently lifted the woman and placed her on his horse. She was too weak to resist, though her dark eyes never left his face, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. As they rode toward his ranch, Thomas wondered what he had gotten himself into, and whether his act of mercy would bring more trouble than he could handle. The ranch house came into view just as the sun reached its highest point in the sky. It was a modest building made of adobe and wood, surrounded by a few outbuildings and a small corral where Thomas kept his horses. The isolation that Thomas usually appreciated now felt overwhelming as he realized he would be caring for someone whose people might consider him an enemy. Thomas carried the woman inside and placed her on his own bed, the only comfortable place in the small house. He had basic medical supplies from treating injured cattle, and he carefully cleaned and bandaged her wound. Throughout the process, she remained conscious but silent, watching his every move with those penetrating dark eyes. As evening approached, Thomas prepared a simple meal and offered her water and food. The woman accepted both with a slight nod, but she still had not spoken a single word. Thomas found himself wondering about her story, who she was, and what had led to the violent scene where he had found her. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was filled with questions that neither could easily answer. Thomas had acted on instinct to save a life, but now he faced the reality of harboring someone whose presence could bring serious consequences. Yet something about her quiet dignity and the way she carried herself despite her injury told him that she was no ordinary person. As night fell over the desert, Thomas made a bed for himself on the floor near the fireplace, giving the wounded woman privacy and comfort. Before he settled down to sleep, he noticed her watching the stars through the small window, and for the first time since he had found her, he saw something other than wariness in her expression. There was a longing there, a connection to something beyond the walls of his simple ranch house. Thomas fell asleep wondering what the morning would bring, and whether his decision to help a stranger would change both of their lives forever. Little did he know that the young woman lying in his bed was not just any Apache, but the daughter of a respected chief, and her disappearance would soon set in motion events that would test everything he believed about right and wrong, about the nature of enemies and friends, and about the power of human compassion to bridge even the deepest divides. Thomas woke before dawn to find the young woman sitting by the window, her silhouette outlined against the pale morning sky. She had managed to stand despite her injury, and her posture suggested she was much stronger than he had initially thought. When she turned to face him, Thomas noticed that the wariness in her eyes had been replaced by something else entirely, a calm assessment that made him feel as though he was the one being studied and judged. For the first time since he had brought her to his ranch, she spoke, her voice clear and surprisingly fluent in English. "You are not like the others who come to take our land," she said simply. "Why did you help me?" Thomas was taken aback by her direct question and her perfect English. He had expected broken words or perhaps no shared language at all. "I couldn't leave you there to die," he replied honestly. "It wouldn't have been right." The woman nodded slowly as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "I am Ayana," she said, using the Apache word that meant eternal blossom. "My father leads the Chiricahua band that lives in the mountains beyond your ranch. Your people and mine have not been friends." Thomas introduced himself and explained that he had chosen this remote location specifically to avoid conflicts with anyone. He told her about his simple life raising cattle and his respect for the land that had belonged to her people long before settlers like him arrived. As they talked, Thomas began to understand that Ayana was not just intelligent but also educated, likely by missionaries or traders who had contact with her tribe. Over the next few days, as Ayana's strength returned, Thomas learned more about the circumstances that had led to her injury. She had been traveling with a small group of warriors to negotiate with other Apache bands about forming an alliance against the increasing pressure from settlers and the U.S. Army. The group had been ambushed by a band of men who were not regular soldiers but appeared to be working for someone with interests in Apache land. "They wanted to capture me alive," Ayana explained as they sat outside the ranch house in the evening. "My father's influence makes me valuable to those who wish to force agreements or create conflicts between our people and yours." Thomas realized that the situation was far more complex than he had imagined. By rescuing Ayana, he had inadvertently interfered with someone's plan, and that someone likely had significant resources and few scruples about how they achieved their goals. The knowledge made him uneasy, but it also strengthened his resolve to protect the woman who had trusted him with her story. During her recovery, Ayana surprised Thomas in many ways. She was knowledgeable about medicine and helped him treat a sick cow using herbs she gathered from around his property. She could predict weather changes with remarkable accuracy and showed him techniques for finding water in the desert that his years of ranching had never taught him. More surprising still was her curiosity about his way of life. She asked detailed questions about his cattle, his methods of farming, and his reasons for choosing such an isolated existence. Thomas found himself enjoying their conversations more than any he had experienced in years. Despite their different backgrounds, they shared a love for the land and a respect for the natural world that made communication easy and comfortable. One evening, as they watched the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and red, Ayana shared more of her story. She told Thomas about her education, how she had learned English from a trader who visited her tribe regularly, and how she had always served as a bridge between her traditional Apache culture and the changing world around them. "My father believes that our people must find a way to survive in a world that is changing, whether we wish it or not," she explained. "Some of our warriors want to fight until the last man falls, but others believe we must learn to live alongside the newcomers without losing who we are." Thomas understood that Ayana represented something rare and valuable, someone who could navigate between two very different worlds and perhaps find a path that honored both. Her presence at his ranch was not just a matter of recovery from injury. It was a moment of possibility that could change how two peoples understood each other. As the days passed, Thomas noticed changes in himself as well. Ayana's presence had brought a richness to his solitary life that he had not realized he was missing. Her insights into the land, her stories of Apache culture, and her thoughtful questions about his own beliefs had expanded his understanding of the world around him. Yet Thomas also knew that this peaceful interlude could not last forever. Ayana's people would be searching for her, and the men who had ambushed her group would eventually realize that their prize had slipped away. Soon both would likely find their way to his isolated ranch, and Thomas would have to face the consequences of his decision to help a stranger. One morning, Ayana announced that her strength had returned enough for her to travel. She stood at the edge of his property, looking toward the mountains where her people lived, and Thomas could see the conflict in her expression. She was torn between her duty to return home and something else that neither of them had yet spoken aloud. "When I go back to my people," she said quietly, "they will ask me many questions about the time I spent here. They will want to know about you, about how you treated me, about what I learned." Thomas nodded, understanding that her answers would have consequences far beyond their personal experience. "What will you tell them?" he asked. Ayanna turned to face him, her dark eyes serious but warm. "I will tell them the truth," she said, "that there are some among your people who still remember what it means to show kindness to a stranger, and that perhaps there is hope for understanding between our worlds after all." That evening, as they prepared for what both knew might be their last night together, neither Thomas nor Ayanna spoke of the growing connection between them or of the difficult choices that lay ahead. Instead, they sat by the fire and shared stories of their different but surprisingly similar dreams for the future, each wondering whether fate had brought them together for a purpose greater than either could imagine alone. The sound of approaching horses broke the morning silence just as Thomas was preparing to escort Ayanna partway back to her territory. Through the window, they could see a cloud of dust rising in the distance, and both knew their peaceful days together had come to an end. Thomas reached for his rifle, but Ayanna placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Wait," she said, studying the approaching riders with the keen eyes of someone who had grown up reading the signs of the desert. "Those are not my people, but they are not the men who attacked me either. Look at how they ride. They move like soldiers but without discipline." Thomas squinted at the approaching group and counted at least 8 men on horseback. They rode in a loose formation that suggested they were comfortable with violence, but not trained military. As they drew closer, Thomas could see that their clothes were a mixture of civilian and military gear, and their weapons looked well-maintained and expensive. "Stay inside," Thomas told Ayanna, but she shook her head firmly. "If they are looking for me, hiding will only make things worse," she replied. "These men serve someone who wants me for their own purposes, and they will not leave until they search everywhere." The riders pulled up in front of the ranch house, their horses snorting and pawing the ground. Their leader was a tall man with a carefully groomed beard and cold gray eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the small ranch. He wore a military-style hat, but civilian clothes and a silver watch chain gleamed across his vest. "Good morning," the man said in a voice that carried authority despite its pleasant tone. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me, and I believe you might be able to help." Thomas stepped onto his porch, keeping his hands visible but ready. "I'm not sure what you mean, mister. I don't have anything that belongs to strangers." The man smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Oh, but I think you do. You see, there was an unfortunate incident a few days ago involving some Apache troublemakers. One of them got away, and we've been tracking signs that lead right to your little ranch here." "I haven't seen any Apache," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the tension he felt. At that moment, Ayanna stepped out of the house and stood beside Thomas, her chin raised defiantly. The lead rider's eyes lit up with satisfaction, and several of his men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. "Well, well," the man said. "There she is. You've saved us quite a bit of trouble, rancher. The Apache princess decides to show herself. I am not hiding from you," Ayanna said clearly. "I am here by my own choice as a guest of this good man who helped me when I was injured." The leader dismounted and walked closer to the porch, his boots making deliberate sounds on the hard ground. "That's a touching story, but you're coming with us now. There are people who are very interested in having a conversation with you." Thomas stepped slightly in front of Ayanna, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "The lady says she's here by choice. I don't see any law enforcement badges, so I'm thinking you boys don't have any legal authority to take anyone anywhere." The man laughed, a sound without humor. "Legal authority? Friend, out here we make our own authority. And right now, my authority says that Apache girl is coming with us, whether you like it or not." "No," Thomas said simply. "She's not." The tension in the air became thick enough to cut with a knife. The mounted men spread out slightly, clearly preparing for violence, while their leader studied Thomas with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. "You know," the leader said conversationally, "it's interesting how some men choose to throw their lives away for strangers. Especially strangers from a tribe that's been raiding settlements and killing good Christian folks." Ayanna stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Cochise of the Chiricahua. If you take me against my will, my father will consider it an act of war against our people. The leader's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Cochise's name, but he maintained his aggressive posture. Your daddy's reputation doesn't scare me, girl. In fact, having his daughter makes you even more valuable to certain parties who are interested in negotiations. Thomas realized they were dealing with men who worked for someone with significant resources and no scruples about using violence to achieve their goals. These weren't random outlaws but organized operatives, which made the situation far more dangerous than a simple confrontation with bandits. Here's what's going to happen, the leader continued. You're going to step aside, rancher, and let us take what we came for. In exchange, we'll let you keep breathing and tend your cattle in peace. And here's what's actually going to happen, Thomas replied, his voice calm but deadly serious. You're going to mount up and ride away from my property, or we're going to have a problem that ends badly for everyone. The leader sighed theatrically. I was hoping we could handle this like civilized men, but if you insist on being difficult. He gestured to his men, and Thomas could see them preparing to draw their weapons. At that moment, Ayanna surprised everyone by whistling sharply, a sound that carried clearly across the desert landscape. The leader spun toward her, his face showing confusion and the first hint of concern. What was that? He demanded. Ayanna smiled for the first time since the men had arrived, and her expression was not entirely pleasant. That was a signal I learned from my people. It carries far in this desert, and it tells anyone listening exactly where to find us. As if to emphasize her point, the distant sound of answering whistles echoed from the rocks and hills surrounding the ranch. The leader's men looked around nervously, suddenly realizing that their isolated target might not be as helpless as they had assumed. You see, Ayanna continued, my people have been watching this place since the day after I arrived. They know I am here, they know I am safe, and they know who my host is. They also now know who you are. The leader's confident demeanor cracked slightly as he realized the tactical situation had shifted dramatically. What had seemed like a simple extraction of a valuable prisoner had become a potential trap, with unknown numbers of Apache warriors positioned in the surrounding terrain. Thomas felt a mixture of surprise and admiration for Ayanna's strategic thinking, but he also understood that the situation had escalated beyond anything he had prepared for. The next few moments would determine whether this confrontation ended in bloodshed or whether there was still a path to peace. The leader looked around at the seemingly empty landscape, clearly trying to calculate odds and options, while his men waited for orders that might lead them into a fight they had not expected and were not prepared for. The standoff continued for several tense minutes as the leader weighed his options. Thomas could see the man's eyes darting between Ayanna, the surrounding landscape, and his own men, who were becoming increasingly nervous as they scanned the rocks and ridges for signs of hidden Apache warriors. You're bluffing, the leader finally said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. If there were Apache out there, they would have attacked already. Ayanna's smile widened slightly. My people are not like the white men who rush into battle without thinking. They watch, they learn, they choose the right moment. They are also curious about why their chief's daughter would choose to stay with a white rancher instead of returning home. Immediately, Thomas realized that Ayanna was buying them time while simultaneously revealing something important about her own situation. Her people were indeed watching, but they were also waiting to understand her choices before taking any action. This put the responsibility for resolving the crisis squarely on her shoulders. What do you want from me? Ayanna asked the leader directly. What is so valuable about one Apache woman that you would risk war with my father's people to obtain it? The leader hesitated, clearly debating how much information to reveal. Finally, he seemed to decide that honesty might serve his purposes. Better than continued threats, there are people in Washington and in the territorial government who believe that certain Apache leaders can be persuaded to sign treaties that would be beneficial to all parties, he said carefully. Having Chief Cochise's daughter as a guest would provide significant leverage in those negotiations. You mean as a hostage? Thomas said flatly. I prefer to think of it as diplomatic security, the leader replied. Miss Ayanna would be treated well and returned to her people once certain agreements were reached. Ayanna laughed, a sound that held no humor. You know nothing of my father or my people if you believe that taking me prisoner would make them more willing to negotiate. It would have the opposite effect entirely. As if to prove her point, a new voice called out from the rocks above the ranch. The words were in Apache, but the tone was clearly authoritative. Thomas saw the leader's men look around frantically, trying to locate the source of the voice. "What did he say?" the leader demanded. Ayana translated calmly. "He said that 8 men with good horses and weapons might be worth something in trade, but that their leader appears to be a fool who does not understand the people he is trying to manipulate." The insult struck home, and Thomas could see the leader's face redden with anger. However, the man was experienced enough to recognize that his tactical position had deteriorated beyond recovery. Whatever his original plan had been, it clearly had not accounted for the possibility that the Apache would be watching and waiting. "This isn't over," the leader said, pointing at Ayana. "You think you're safe hiding behind your father's reputation and this rancher's misguided protection, but there are forces at work here bigger than both of you understand." "Perhaps," Ayana replied. "But today, right now, you and your men are going to leave this place and not return. Because if you do not, the next conversation will be with my father's war leaders, and they are far less patient with threats than I am." Thomas watched the complex calculation playing out in the leader's expression. The man was clearly accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and superior force, but the current situation offered neither advantage. To press the confrontation would risk a fight against an unknown number of Apache warriors on terrain they knew intimately, with the only certain outcome being bloodshed that would accomplish nothing. After what felt like an eternity, the leader nodded curtly to his men. "Mount up," he ordered. "We're leaving." As the men prepared to go, the leader turned back to Thomas. "You might want to think carefully about the choices you're making, rancher. Standing between powerful people and what they want is a dangerous game, especially for someone who lives so far from any help." "I'll keep that in mind," Thomas replied evenly. The leader mounted his horse and looked down at both Thomas and Ayana. "This land is changing whether you want to accept it or not. The Apache way of life is ending, and people who try to stand in the way of progress tend to get swept aside." "Maybe," Ayana said, stepping closer to Thomas in a gesture that clearly indicated her choice of allies. "But not today, and not by you." The riders departed in a cloud of dust, their horses moving faster than they had when they arrived. Thomas and Ayana watched until they disappeared into the desert landscape, but neither relaxed completely until the sound of hoofbeats faded entirely. "That was well done," came a voice from behind them. Thomas spun around to see an Apache warrior stepping out from behind his barn, moving with the silent grace that had allowed him to approach undetected. The man was older than Ayana but carried himself with the confident bearing of an experienced fighter. "My brother Nalnish," Ayana said by way of introduction. "He has been watching over me since I arrived here." Thomas felt a mixture of surprise and slight embarrassment that his ranch had been under Apache surveillance without his knowledge, but he also understood that it had ultimately worked in their favor. Nalnish studied Thomas carefully before speaking in accented but clear English. "My sister says you are a good man who helped her when she was hurt. She also says you have shown her respect and kindness without asking for anything in return." "She's been a good guest," Thomas replied simply. "It is not often that we find white men who act with honor toward our people," Nalnish continued. "My father will want to know about you, about what kind of man would risk his life for someone from a tribe he does not know." Thomas realized that the events of the morning had opened a door between his world and theirs, but he was not sure what lay on the other side. The leader's words about powerful forces and changing times echoed in his mind, suggesting that larger conflicts were brewing that would affect everyone in the territory. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, looking between the siblings. Ayana exchanged a long look with her brother before answering. "Now we must decide whether the friendship that has grown between us is strong enough to survive the storms that are coming," she said. "Because those men will return probably with more soldiers and better plans, and my people must decide whether to trust a white man who has shown kindness to one of their own." Thomas looked out across his small ranch, the simple life he had built for himself in this remote corner of the territory, and realized that everything was about to change in ways he could never have imagined when he found an injured young woman in the desert just days before. 3 days after the confrontation with the armed men, Ayana made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of returning immediately to her father's stronghold in the mountains, she asked Thomas if she could stay longer at the ranch. Her reason, she explained to her brother Nalnish, was that she needed time to fully recover from her injuries and to think carefully about what she would tell their father about her experiences. The truth was more complex. During her time at the ranch, Ayanna had discovered something she had never expected to find among the white settlers, a sense of peace and possibility that seemed impossible in the growing tensions between their peoples. Thomas treated her as an equal, listened to her thoughts and ideas, and showed genuine interest in learning about Apache culture without trying to change or judge it. For his part, Thomas found that he dreaded the thought of Ayanna leaving. Her presence had transformed his solitary existence into something richer and more meaningful than he had ever imagined possible. Their evening conversations by the fire had become the highlight of his days, and her insights into the natural world had taught him more about his own land than years of lonely observation. Nalnish was skeptical of his sister's decision, but agreed to carry word to their father that she was safe and would return when she felt ready. Before he left, he spent time observing Thomas work around the ranch, testing the white man's character through careful conversation and shared tasks. "You care for her?" Nalnish said one evening as they worked together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a recent storm. Thomas paused in his work, considering how to answer honestly. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." "This caring could bring great trouble to both of you," Nalnish warned. "My people and yours are not meant to walk the same path." "Maybe not," Thomas replied. "But maybe it's time someone tried to build a bridge between those paths." Over the following weeks, Ayanna and Thomas fell into a routine that felt natural despite its unusual nature. She taught him Apache words and showed him techniques for tracking animals and reading weather signs. In return, he shared his knowledge of ranching and farming, and they worked together to improve his small operation. More importantly, they talked. They discussed their different beliefs about the land, about family, about the future of the territory they both called home. They found that despite their different backgrounds, they shared remarkably similar values about honor, respect for nature, and the importance of treating others with dignity. Word of the unusual arrangement began to spread among both communities. Some of Thomas's white neighbors were scandalized by reports that he was harboring an Apache woman on his ranch. A few brave souls rode out to see for themselves, and most left with their preconceptions challenged by Ayanna's intelligence and dignified bearing. Similarly, Apache warriors occasionally appeared at the ranch to check on Ayanna and assess Thomas's character. Some were suspicious and hostile, but others were curious about the white man who had earned their chief's daughter's respect. These visits became informal opportunities for cultural exchange, with both sides learning that their supposed enemies were more complex than they had imagined. The situation took a dramatic turn when a territorial official named Commissioner Harrison arrived at the ranch with a small military escort. Harrison was a thin, nervous man who represented the federal government's efforts to negotiate treaties with various Apache bands. He had heard reports of the unusual relationship between Thomas and Ayanna and saw an opportunity to advance his own career. "Miss," Harrison said to Ayanna, his tone condescending despite his obvious nervousness, "I understand you're the daughter of the Apache leader Cochise. Your presence here represents a valuable opportunity for peaceful negotiations between your people and the territorial government." Ayanna listened politely, but her expression remained neutral. "What kind of opportunity?" she asked. "Well," Harrison continued, "if you were to accompany me to the territorial capital, you could serve as an intermediary between your father and our government. Think of the good you could do for both our peoples by helping us reach a peaceful agreement." Thomas recognized the proposal for what it really was, another attempt to use Ayanna as leverage against her father. "She's not interested," he said firmly. Harrison turned to Thomas with barely concealed irritation. "I wasn't speaking to you, rancher. This is a matter of territorial security and federal policy. Your opinions are not relevant." "They are relevant to me," Ayanna said quietly, but her voice carried unmistakable authority. "Thomas Mitchell has shown me more respect and courtesy than any government official ever has. If you wish to negotiate with my people, you might start by learning how to show proper respect to those you claim to want to help." Harrison's face flushed red. "Young woman, you may not understand the larger issues at stake here. The Apache raids on settlements must stop, and your people must accept that they cannot continue their wandering ways forever." The territory is being developed for the good of all citizens. Ayanna stood, her posture radiating the dignity of her royal heritage. And you, Commissioner Harrison, may not understand that my people have lived on this land for countless generations. We know every canyon, every water source, every game trail. We have taken care of this land and it has taken care of us. What you call development, we call destruction. The confrontation might have escalated, but at that moment the sound of approaching horses interrupted the conversation. A group of Apache warriors appeared on the ridge overlooking the ranch, their presence a clear message that Ayanna was under their protection. Among the riders was an older man, whose bearing and decorations marked him as someone of great importance. Thomas realized he was looking at Chief Cochise himself, Ayanna's father, who had come to see for himself the white rancher who had earned his daughter's respect. Cochise rode down to the ranch house, his warriors following at a respectful distance. He was a man in his 60s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. His eyes were intelligent and watchful, missing nothing as he surveyed the scene before him. "My daughter," he said in English, dismounting and embracing Ayanna warmly. "You have been away from us long enough. It is time for you to come home." Ayanna looked between her father, Thomas, and Commissioner Harrison, understanding that this moment would determine not just her own future, but possibly the fate of the fragile understanding that had been growing between the two communities. "Father," she said carefully, "I have learned much during my time here. I have learned that not all white men are our enemies, and that there may be possibilities for peace that we have not yet explored." Cochise studied Thomas intently, his gaze seeming to look deep into the rancher's character. "You are the one who helped my daughter when she was injured," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, meeting the chief's gaze steadily. "And you ask for nothing in return?" "Nothing except the chance to know her and learn from her," Thomas answered honestly. Commissioner Harrison, sensing that the situation was slipping beyond his control, stepped forward. "Chief Cochise, I am Commissioner Harrison, representing the territorial government. This meeting provides an excellent opportunity for us to discuss the treaties that would benefit both our peoples." Cochise turned his attention to Harrison, and the temperature of his gaze seemed to drop several degrees. "You speak of treaties that would benefit our peoples, but what I see is a man who comes to my daughter's place of safety with soldiers, as if she were a prisoner to be negotiated over rather than a person to be respected." The chief's words hung in the air, and Thomas realized that the next few minutes would determine whether this encounter led to greater understanding or deeper conflict between the two worlds that had intersected at his small ranch. The tension around the ranch house was thick as Chief Cochise studied the faces of everyone present. Commissioner Harrison shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable under the Apache leader's intense scrutiny, while his military escort remained alert but uncertain about their role in this delicate situation. Ayanna stepped forward, positioning herself where she could address both her father and the government representative. "Father, Commissioner Harrison represents the kind of thinking that has made peace difficult between our peoples. He sees me not as a person with my own thoughts and choices, but as a tool to be used for political purposes." She turned to face Harrison directly. "And you, Commissioner, demonstrate perfectly why your treaties have failed. You come here with soldiers, speaking of opportunities and benefits, but you show no understanding of who we are or what we value." Thomas watched this exchange with growing admiration for Ayanna's courage and wisdom. She was addressing both sides of the conflict with equal directness, refusing to let either group use her for their own purposes. Chief Cochise nodded approvingly at his daughter's words, then addressed Thomas directly. "Rancher Mitchell, my daughter tells me you have treated her with respect and have learned about our ways without trying to change them. This is unusual among your people." "She has taught me much, Chief Cochise," Thomas replied, "about the land, about honor, about seeing beyond the differences that divide people. I am grateful for the opportunity to know her." The old chief studied Thomas for a long moment before making a decision that surprised everyone present. "Commissioner Harrison," he said, his voice carrying the authority of generations of leadership, "you wish to negotiate with the Apache people. Very well. But you will not do so by threatening or manipulating my daughter. If you truly want peace, you must first learn what peace means." Harrison straightened, sensing an opportunity despite the rebuke. "I am prepared to listen to any reasonable proposals, Chief Cochise." "Then listen to this," Cochise replied. My daughter has found something here that your government's treaties have never offered: genuine respect and understanding between our peoples. This rancher has shown that it is possible for Apache and White to live in harmony without one trying to dominate the other. Ayanna felt her heart racing as she realized what her father might be suggesting. Throughout her weeks at the ranch, she had felt a growing connection to Thomas that went far beyond gratitude for his help. She had found in him a kindness and strength that matched her own values, and she had begun to imagine a life that bridged both worlds. What I propose, Cochise continued, is that my daughter remain here as an ambassador between our peoples if that is her choice. She will marry this rancher if he will have her, and their union will serve as an example of how Apache and White can build a future together. The silence that followed was deafening. Commissioner Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, while his military escort looked uncertain about how to react to this unexpected development. Thomas felt his heart pounding as he looked at Ayanna, trying to read her expression. Ayanna turned to face Thomas, her eyes bright with tears that might have been joy or fear or both. "Is this what you want?" she asked quietly. "A life together, knowing that it will bring challenges from both our peoples?" Thomas stepped forward and took her hands in his, not caring who was watching. "Ayanna, these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. If you'll have me, I want nothing more than to build that life together." Her smile was radiant as she nodded, and Thomas felt as though the sun had just risen in his heart. But their moment of joy was interrupted by Commissioner Harrison's outraged voice. "This is preposterous," he sputtered. "You cannot resolve complex territorial issues with a romantic gesture. There are legal questions, treaty obligations, federal jurisdiction to consider." Chief Cochise turned to Harrison with an expression that could have frozen the desert. "You speak of legal questions, but what law gives you the right to dictate who my daughter may marry? You speak of treaties, but your government has broken every treaty it has ever made with my people. You speak of federal jurisdiction, but this rancher's land is his own, freely chosen and honestly worked." The chief's words carried such authority that even Harrison fell silent. Cochise continued, "For too long your people and mine have met only in conflict. Here is a chance for something different. A union based on love and respect rather than conquest and submission. If you are wise, you will support it rather than oppose it." Thomas realized that what was happening went far beyond a simple marriage proposal. Cochise was offering a new model for relationships between the Apache and the white settlers, one based on mutual respect rather than domination. It was a bold and risky strategy that could either open new possibilities for peace or bring down the wrath of those who profited from continued conflict. Over the next several hours, as the sun moved across the desert sky, an extraordinary conversation took place around Thomas's ranch house. Cochise spoke of his people's long history with the land, their values, and their hopes for survival in a changing world. Thomas shared his own vision of a life that honored both traditions while building something new. Ayanna served as translator not just of languages, but of cultures, helping each side understand concepts and values that had no direct equivalent in their own experience. Her education and unique position as bridge between worlds made her an invaluable voice in the discussions. Commissioner Harrison, though clearly uncomfortable with developments beyond his control, began to see political opportunities in the situation. A successful marriage between Apache nobility and a respected white rancher could indeed serve as a powerful symbol of peaceful coexistence, one that might make his own job easier. As evening approached, Chief Cochise announced his decision. "If this is truly what my daughter chooses, and if this man will swear to honor Apache ways as well as his own, then let their union be a bridge between our peoples." The wedding took place 3 days later, conducted according to both Apache and Christian traditions. Warriors and settlers who had been enemies just weeks before gathered to witness the ceremony that many saw as a sign of hope for the future. Thomas wore his best clothes alongside traditional Apache ornaments that Ayanna had made for him. She wore a white dress decorated with beadwork that told the story of their courtship in symbols that her people could read like words. As they exchanged vows in both English and Apache, promising to honor each other's traditions while building something new together, the assembled crowd witnessed something unprecedented in the territory's history, a celebration that brought together two worlds in peace. Commissioner Harrison, perhaps seeing the political value of being associated with such a historic moment, served as one of the official witnesses. In his report to the territorial government, he would describe the wedding as a significant diplomatic breakthrough that demonstrated new possibilities for peaceful coexistence. But for Thomas and Ayanna, the political implications mattered less than the personal reality of the life they were beginning together. As they stood before their friends and families, hands joined and hearts united, they saw not the end of an extraordinary courtship, but the beginning of an even more extraordinary partnership. Their story would inspire others in both communities to look beyond old prejudices and seek understanding across cultural divides. The ranch became a meeting place where Apache and White could interact in peace, sharing knowledge and building relationships that had seemed impossible just months before. In the years that followed, Thomas and Ayanna's marriage became a symbol of hope during some of the territory's darkest conflicts. Their children grew up speaking both English and Apache, comfortable in both worlds, and able to serve as bridges between communities that needed their unique perspective. The love story that began with an act of simple human kindness in the desert had grown into something far greater, a demonstration that even the deepest cultural divides could be crossed by people willing to see beyond their differences to the common humanity that connected them all. And in a land torn by conflict and mistrust, that was perhaps the greatest gift they could offer to the generations that would follow.